Hi everyone, in this video we're going to talk about the different types of websites that exist on the World Wide Web and the difference between that and the internet, as well as a couple of other little things you need to know. Before we start any of that, we need to know what a web page actually is. So a web page can be any document or file from the World Wide Web accessed using something called a web browser, which we'll get to in a minute. But you've probably seen web pages like this before. This is our web page, which hopefully you've seen at some point. So a web page can be anything, can be any file at all. Most websites, which is just a number of web pages put together, are just kind of acting as a base for loads of other files to be found. So you can see it's kind of like a document, almost like a Word document or a PowerPoint, but it's kind of a bit more structured, and you can click into different areas to move into other different web pages. That's kind of how it works. It can be any document or file at all. Now, we use a web browser to access it. What is a web browser then? So a web browser is quite simple. It's just the program or the software, as we talked about last week, that you use to access the World Wide Web. So we've got three examples on the side here. We've got Google Chrome, which is very popular these days. We've got Microsoft Edge or Internet Explorer, which is not too far behind, although generally we find that Chrome has a few more features, and also Safari, which you might use on your Mac or your iPhone or iPad. Now, the functionality of these three web browsers is pretty similar. They all have the same role, and that is to open websites and web pages and allow you to browse the World Wide Web. They all have slightly different features and slightly different functions, but really they all perform the same role. So what actually makes up a web page then? So you've probably seen something like this before at the top of a web page. So this is called the address or the URL, Uniform Resource Locator. But you don't necessarily need to know that much. All you need to know is what it's kind of made up of, what it's actually made up of. So we've got here 4 pieces, starting with HTTP. Now, you don't necessarily need to know that that means Hypertext Transfer Protocol, but you do need to know that that has to be at the start of a web page with the colon and the 2 forward slashes to make that something that the browser will recognize. Now, you may also know that sometimes you can see a little S here as well. That stands for secure, and if that S is there, that means the web page is encrypted, which we talked about a little bit before as well. That means the web page is secure, so any details that you may have on there are going to be secretive only to you. So that means if you have any passwords, that means that is definitely secure and safe. Now, the www dot, that means World Wide Web. And the World Wide Web is the collection of all of the web pages. Now, they're connected with something called a hyperlink. Now, a hyperlink is actually what we're looking at right here. You can see that it's underlined, and all links on this, like this, on the internet can be clicked into, and that's how hyperlinks work. So you click on one link and it takes you to another web page. So the World Wide Web is just all of those different web pages connected with those hyperlinks. Then we've got the actual name of the page itself. Now, you may remember this from back in Year 7 when we talked about emails. This is something called the domain. So the domain name is the actual name of that website or that web page. So that's the owner of that page. And then we've got the final point here. Its fancy name is the directory. But really, you can think of it as a folder or file. So, for example, I know that without even going on the web page, I know this is probably going to be BBC's web page, and it's going to be their news round page. So it's going to be in their news round folder. So you have to imagine if you were in your files or your folders, you might look for your work in your Year 8 computing folder. So you could imagine if your folders were a web page for some reason, you can have year8.co.uk/computing, and then you'd have all your computing work available, for example. And it's exactly the same when it comes to web page addresses and URLs. You have your domain name, and then you follow that up with your folder or file. So let's talk about just a couple of the common examples of websites that exist. So you've got e-commerce, which is a fancy word for kind of online shopping, really. So e-commerce websites are where you buy and sell goods and services on the World Wide Web. So things like Amazon and eBay, which are growing in popularity all the time, constantly at the moment, this is where you can buy or sell goods and services. Pretty straightforward, really. Anything like clothes websites like ASOS, and there are loads of other websites out there. As long as you're selling and buying, that is e-commerce. So there you go, pretty clear. You've also got websites which are social networking. So obviously you've got Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. All those sorts of websites are where you are enabled to create and share content with others on the internet or on the web. So any website that does that, I mean, you could argue that YouTube is similar because you're posting videos which are created and then shared with others online. Loads of websites like that are classed as social networking. And just as another one, just because it's becoming more and more prevalent as time goes on, cloud computing is where you can save programs, documents, data over the internet using these companies' servers. So basically just having a large amount of area to save data, which isn't yours. So there are websites that exist like Google Drive and Dropbox, and iCloud probably is one that you're most familiar with. A common use of iCloud is that if you save a file, you can then, on your phone this is, that will then be backed up and sent to the iCloud, so it's an extra copy of that file which is safe and secure. So if anything happens to your phone, if it goes down the stairs or something and breaks, you've got access to the same files using the iCloud, so if you do get a replacement phone, you have the same files again. So there are loads of websites that do this. Even gaming services offer this these days as well. So you can access your files from another location, which is really, really good because you have extra storage potentially without having to pay for it on the device you're actually using. And I always get this question, and it's really important to make this distinction between what the difference between the internet, the World Wide Web, and the web browser, a web browser is. So I want to make it very, very clear. I've been talking about the World Wide Web a lot in this video, which is all of the web pages on the internet which are connected together using hyperlinks. So the World Wide Web is just what we call all the different web pages connected together. So for example, if I had our King Charles website, and that linked to the BBC, for example, that is two web pages linked together using hyperlinks. So these are just a very, very small part of the World Wide Web. That technically is not the internet. The internet is well, let's say we've got a computer and we've got a phone, for example. The actual physical computers connecting to each other, they have to connect together using lots of network hardware. They have to use routers. They have to use loads of different hardware to actually connect them together physically. That, with all of the computers connected together, is the internet. So World Wide Web is the web pages, so the software connecting together, the programs, whereas the internet is the actual hardware, so the phones, the PCs connecting together. And as I mentioned before, just to make sure it's really clear, a web browser is the actual program you use to connect to the World Wide Web. So you might go on something like Google Chrome or Internet Explorer, as we saw a second ago, and then you would actually be able to access these web pages using the web browser. So making that really, really clear, so World Wide Web is software, pages connected together using hyperlinks. The internet is a global network of all computers physically connected together, and the web browser is the program that you use. I hope that was nice and clear. There are loads of help links on the task as you go through it this week as well, so please do have a look if you have any further questions.